one reason or another. Sometimes the selection is very surprising. Many years ago, I was in a big congregation that had a big school. And so the congregation had a senior pastor who was its founder. The school had a different guy who was the head of the school. And he had a doctorate, and he was extraordinarily different than the senior pastor. The senior pastor was sort of a free-spirited, very relaxed, just go for it. Let the Spirit flow. He was not really a wild man, but he wasn't that far from it. Okay? And he's very, very, very popular guy, known widely all over the world. The guy who was the head of the school was more or less the opposite of all of those things. He was very controlled, very scholarly. He had a doctorate, and his doctrine, interestingly, was actually different than that of the congregation. He believed some different things. So depending upon who was preaching, you might hear that it was that way or it was that way. And again, the senior pastor, being sort of wild and crazy, apparently didn't mind if from time to time his head of his school came in and taught something different than what he taught. I always thought that seemed wrong, trying to confuse the sheep rather than lead them. But anyway, the guy who was the head of the school, this very sort of straight-laced guy, I found out, much to my surprise, that his favorite book of scripture wasn't Romans or Devarim or... It was Tehillim, yeah. That was his favorite book because it was so full of emotion and passion. And I thought, well, maybe he liked the book so much because it was sort of missing in his life. Or who knows what happens at home, So, anyway, but an earlier congregation I was in was a Pentecostal one, and the pastor there was really a cute story. He had been a Nazarene. Okay, Nazarene assembly forbids speaking in tongues and all that. Now he ends up being Pentecostal. So one might ask, how does that happen? Well, what happened was, after years of being a pastor, he entered into a depression. And he went out someplace out in western Kansas, away from his family, just had to get away, had to have some time to think. And he checked into a motel, and in his depression, he had created something that looked like how he felt. In other words, all the curtains were drawn. It was dark. It was quiet. It was miserable. So he created this environment around himself. But one day, he turned on the television to the 700 Club. And, what's the name of the guy who is the main guy of the 700 Club? I can't remember his name. But anyway, he often has this thing where he looks into the camera. And,
His name is Spence something.
Yes. It'll come to us. But anyway, he looks at the camera and he says, I'm having a picture right now of a person, and he'll describe a situation and then he'll give a word. All right, well now this Nazarene, not believing in the operation of the gifts, is sitting there in this dark motel room in western Kansas, almost suicidally depressed, Pat Robertson. And he turns on the 700 Club and he looks on the screen, and there's Pat Robertson talking about a conservative pastor in a small motel room, and it's dark, and he's depressed, and he's thinking about suicide, and he just turned on the TV, and it was the will of Elohim, because he had a word for this guy, and the guy sits there absolutely covered in goose flesh, because he's a non-believing in gifts of the Spirit, Nazarene guy sitting in a room, and he's looking at the TV, and Pat Robertson is talking to him, absolutely, specifically, in detail. Well, I mean, it would have an effect on me.